History is Wrong by Erich von Daniken. Narrated by John Allen Nelson. Copyright 2009 by Erich von Daniken. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Career Press and was produced in the year 2011 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Keep listening after History is Wrong for a bonus interview with author Erich von Daniken. Mysterious books. An unusual question. My quick survey only took a couple of days. I started with my wife, the apple of my eye, and continued at the office. I asked everyone the same question. Then I called some of my relatives, and later, feeling a little pluckier, even complete strangers in a restaurant. "Excuse me, could I ask you a question?" I was polite, as one is, even though a lot of the guests simply wrinkled their brows in puzzlement, seemingly asking themselves, "What the hell does this guy want?" But in the end, I had asked 100 people, and that was enough. Have you ever heard of the Voynich manuscript? The what? Out of 100 people, only one had ever heard of the Voynich manuscript, and even then knew nothing of any consequence. Voynich manuscript? Wasn't there something about that in PM magazine in Germany? Voynich? Some sort of secret code from the Second World War? A secret organization? Voynich. Voynich? Yet there are countless pages about the Voynich manuscript on the Internet. For instance, at www.voynich.nu, a site that also features countless links to other sources. Hundreds of treatises have been written about the Voynich manuscript by both scientists and laymen alike, including books, one of the best by the Britons Kennedy and Churchill, the Voynich manuscript. It contains the entire history of this puzzling and crazy document, including much of the speculation and attempts at deciphering the text. To be honest, just about everything that could be written about the Voynich manuscript has already been written, so it makes no sense to repeat it here. Nevertheless, there are still a few blank spots on the world map of Voynich scholarship interconnections that I have never encountered in any of the literature about the Voynich manuscript. Our way of thinking, so we believe, is characterized by logic and information. In reality, we are just like the verses of an enormous book, from which we don't even know the first 4,000 pages. We're living on a single page, and in terms of the entire composition, we know neither the vocabulary nor even the alphabet. Today's reason cannot accept the reason of the past. And in so saying, I turn to the people who have remained intelligent even while being a part of academia. My listeners shouldn't end up like the 100 people I had questioned earlier. So for that reason, I'd like to tell you a little about the incredible Voynich manuscript. The man behind the manuscript. On October 31st, 1865, in the city of Telsi in Lithuania, the Voynich family was blessed by the arrival of a son. Records show that they christened him Mikhail, but he changed this in later life to Wilfrid. His father held a position in a government office and sent him first to school and then to university in Moscow, where he studied chemistry and qualified as a pharmacist. He became politically active, becoming involved with the Polish nationalist movement, which was fighting to liberate Poland from the Russians. He joined a group of young activists who were attempting to save two of their comrades from execution. This led to his arrest in 1885 and incarceration in solitary confinement in a Warsaw prison. In the summer of 1887, Wilfrid was to be transported to a prison camp in Siberia, but somehow he escaped and went on the run. He made his way, no one quite knows how, to London, where he resurfaced 3 years later. Living in the London suburb of Chiswick, he met up with a group of fanatical Englishmen and exiled Russians bent on ending the rule of the Tsar. They published a revolutionary magazine called Free Russia, which Wilfrid Voynich sold on the streets. With the help of his girlfriend Ethel Boole, he worked his way up to becoming manager of a small bookshop. In September 1902, the two married, not purely for love, partially for convenience, as Wilfrid wanted to take on British nationality, and he could only do this by marrying a British citizen. Wilfrid Voynich led an exciting life with many ups and downs, and he was permanently short of money. Mr. and Mrs. Voynich began smuggling banned books to Russia, and Wilfrid lived in constant fear of becoming the victim of a political attack. So he traveled under a series of aliases, depending on which country he was in and what company he was keeping. Back in London, Voynich opened an antiquarian bookshop and began buying up old manuscripts and books. The shop was soon a chaotic treasure trove of exotic parchments and printed material from throughout the centuries. Of the discovery of the most mysterious book in the world, Voynich claimed he had discovered it in an old castle in southern Europe. The richly colored manuscript had lain hidden in an old chest, and nobody had known of its existence. The entire work is written down on parchment and illustrated with countless colored drawings, and he had immediately suspected that it was produced sometime in the second half of the 13th century. Since that time, the unreadable work has been known as the Voynich manuscript. What happened next? A while after Voynich's death, on March 19, 1931, it became known that his claim to have found the manuscript in an old castle was a fabrication. Wilfrid left behind a will in which he left the manuscript to his wife Ethel and his secretary Anne Nill. After Ethel's death, Anne Nill became the sole owner of the Voynich manuscript, and she confessed in a letter that was not to be published until after her death that Wilfrid had found the manuscript in 1912 in a former Jesuit collegio in the Via Mondragone. This via had been a Jesuit training center and had housed an impressive collection of old manuscripts from the library of the Collegium Romanum. In 1870, the Jesuits had feared that Vittorio Emanuel's soldiers might plunder the library to make themselves a bit of money, so the collection was transferred to the Via Mondragone in Frascati, north of Rome. This was where Voynich discovered the manuscript, while rummaging around in an old trunk. The Jesuits had needed money for restoration work to their ramshackle building, and the brothers had readily offered the crafty bookseller from London cases full of yellowing manuscripts. Voynich purchased 30 old volumes, and the Jesuits, who had thought themselves sly, never realized what a treasure they had pressed into Wilfrid Voynich's willing hands. To an antiquarian like Wilfrid Voynich, who regularly dealt with piles upon piles of ancient texts, the curious multicolored parchment in the heavy dark brown and matte varnished trunk must have really leapt out and caught the eye. But what truly surprised him was a letter he found pressed between the front cover and the first page. This letter, composed in Latin, had been written by a certain Johannes Marcus Marci de Kronland in Prague and was dated August 19, 1666. It was addressed to his friend Athanasius Kircher, and explained how he was sending him a work that no one could read. If anyone could decipher the text, he wrote, it would be Athanasius. On the origin of the manuscript, Marci wrote, Dr. Raphael, tutor in the Bohemian language to Ferdinand III, then King of Bohemia, told me the said book had belonged to the Emperor Rudolph, and that he presented to the bearer who brought him the book 600 ducats. He believed the author was Roger Bacon, the Englishman. This is where the story starts getting complicated. Emperor Rudolph II, crowned in 1576, was a melancholic man plagued by self-doubt and delusions, who put great faith in astrologers and magicians, even sponsoring them with gifts of money. At that time, Prague, Rudolph's capital, was a center of secret societies, alchemists, and occultists. Prague was the city of the Golem, a city where the Apocalypse, the secret revelation that follows the four Gospels of the New Testament, was a frequent topic of daily conversation. The Voynich manuscript would have fit rather well into that period, shortly before the outbreak of the 30 Years' War, as well as being something that would have appealed to the court of Rudolph II. Unfortunately, Marci had also noted in his letter to Athanasius that Emperor Rudolph also believed that the manuscript was the work of Roger Bacon. The Bacon Connection. This hot tip must have electrified Wilfrid Voynich, as Roger Bacon, circa 1214 through 1294, was considered by many to be a universal genius. Bacon had studied in Oxford and taught philosophy in Paris. He was the author of numerous works, such as the Opus Maius, the Opus Minus, the Opus Tertium, and a phenomenal encyclopedia. Bacon was way ahead of his time. He wrote about ships of the future that could be steered without a rudder and could be operated by a single man. and about fighting vehicles that could move themselves with incredible power. He also had a few things to say about flying, even back in 1256. Flying machines, instrumenta volandi, will be constructed. They were manufactured before a time, and it is certain that man will have an instrument to fly. Bacon, who also criticized the moral authority of the Church, lived in dangerous times. After the publishing of his final work, Compendium Studii Theologiae, Bacon was named Doctor Mirabilis for his linguistic and scientific achievement. Seemingly to show his conformity, he joined the Franciscan order, but very soon came into conflict with his superiors and was even placed under monastic arrest. Is this the same Roger Bacon who is supposed to be the author of the Voynich manuscript? There is no proof, but it can't be completely excluded as a possibility. A book of the scope of the Voynich manuscript, however, would have probably been too great a challenge even for one as talented as Roger Bacon. After all, it contains a completely new alphabet which defies all logic, and color illustrations of plants and utensils that existed nowhere in the world. On the other hand, Bacon must surely have had access to certain ancient texts. Otherwise, he could hardly have gone on about classical flying machines in his tract about the secret arts. These kinds of flying devices were indeed often mentioned in ancient documents. The annals tell the tale of the Chinese king Zheng Tang, who owned flying wagons that were not produced in his own workshops, but came from a distant folk called Qigong. This race lived 40,000 li beyond the Jade Gate. Wherever that was, it must have been at least halfway around the world, because 1 li corresponded to 644.40 meters. That makes 40,000 li more than 25,000 kilometers. Word for word, the Qigong people were described as follows. They could even manufacture flying wagons that in a good wind could cover great distances. In the time of Tang, around 1760 BC, the west wind brought such a wagon to Yuzhou, Honan, whereupon Tang destroyed it because he did not want his people to see such a thing. Chinese chronicler Kuo Po, 270 through 324 AD, picked up where his forebears left off, writing, "The intricate work of the fabulous Qigong people is truly admirable. Together with the wind, they have exerted their brains and invented a flying wagon, which, climbing and sinking depending on their path, brought guests to Tang." Flying machines such as these, although they may seem to us today a little bizarre, have been preserved in drawings and wall paintings. King Zheng Tang hid these ancient flyers from his subjects. His chief engineer, Qigong Shi, even managed to replicate one of the heavenly wagons, but the flying monstrosity was later destroyed to protect its secrets forever. Disarmament in ancient China. In his work Shanghai Tixing, chronicler Kuo Po tells of various occurrences that took place in that epoch. His writings not only include reports on the flying wagons, but also describe flying wheels. My short detour on ancient aviation was not made without reason. Did Roger Bacon know of texts such as these? Those who are acquainted with my books know that flying wagons appear in countless historical traditions. It's just that no one takes notice of them. Indian King Rumanvat, who reigned many thousand years ago, even had a massive skyship built in which many groups of people could be transported at once. In the Indian epics Ramayana and Mahabharata, there are more than 50 passages that clearly describe flying machines, and in the Ethiopian Kebra Nagast, the Book of the Glory of Kings, the description of King Solomon's flying wagon even includes details of top speeds. And so on and so on. Those who don't know these ancient texts about aviation should keep quiet. It seems to me that Roger Bacon must have known at least one of these old sources, and for that reason he didn't stay quiet at all. All these ancient literary traditions from past epochs have a big problem, one of many. Only a handful of people know the texts. On top of that, countless thousands of books from the past no longer exist. The Great Library of Alexandria went up in flames in 47 AD and again in 391 AD. The same happened with the libraries of Jerusalem, Pergamon, and many other great cities of antiquity where wars raged. And when Central America was conquered by the soldiers of the cross, the monks in their holy fervor burnt thousands of manuscripts written by the Maya and the Aztecs. All that antique knowledge simply gone up in smoke. Where are the originals of texts like Enoch, Solomon, Manetho, and the like? Where are the original works about Atlantis? My little departure into the gulf of time reveals an insipid, unknowing society that passes judgment as if it actually knew something. Off to the United States. Following his exciting find in the Via Mandragone in Frascati, Wilfrid Voynich traveled to the United States in November 1914. He opened a small antiquarian bookshop and gave lectures to public and private circles. One person who was particularly impressed with the manuscript was philologist William Newbolt, professor of intellectual and moral philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. In 1919, Professor Newbolt began an attempt to decipher the text, even though he only had access to a few pages of the manuscript. He quickly developed a theory that the Voynich manuscript contained microscopic characters that would only be revealed under extreme magnification. In a lecture he delivered on April 20, 1921, Newbolt claimed he was able to translate the crude text. Unfortunately for him, he also believed that the manuscript had been written by Roger Bacon. 10 years later, Professor Newbolt's decipherment was definitively debunked. There are no hidden characters in the Voynich manuscript, and Newbolt's translation turned out to be just hot air. The wishful thinking of an academic who would dearly have loved to make history himself. Wilfrid Voynich desperately needed money. He set the price of the manuscript at $160,000 and wasn't prepared to budge. He was left sitting holding a pile of colored parchments of uncertain heritage that no one could read and no one wanted to buy. A manuscript, let's not forget, with a blank cover, no title, and no author. By the time Wilfrid died in 1931, there was still no potential buyer in sight. He left the manuscript to his wife Ethel and his secretary Anne Nill. Following Ethel's death, Nill finally managed to sell the pile of parchments to an antique book dealer from New York, Hans Peter Krauss, for $24,500. Krauss put the price back up to the same amount that Voynich had demanded, $160,000, and, like Voynich himself before him, wasn't willing to bargain. In 1969, Krauss finally donated the manuscript to Yale University, which is where it has remained to this day, in the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, with the catalog number MS-408. A cryptographic challenge. For nearly 80 years, countless specialists have tried their hand at unraveling the Voynich puzzle, including some of the world's best cryptographers, who would usually not have the slightest problem cracking any code. These specialists have analyzed the frequency of glyphs, compared them with handwritten texts from the 13th century, attempted to separate vowels from consonants. All in vain. Uli Kulke, a science correspondent from the German journal Die Welt, covered one of the more recent attempts. He reported how British computer scientist Gordon Rugg had tried to use techniques from the 16th century to demonstrate that the manuscript was a fake. Rugg had used a table with 40 horizontal rows and 39 vertical columns containing various groupings of Voynich characters. Afterward, he used a Cardan grill with 3 holes, which was moved about to display combinations of these characters. The result was gibberish without any meaning whatsoever, but with the same internal structure as the original text. The Voynich manuscript, however, consists of much more than just indefinite syllables or letters. There are also the colored drawings that are placed left or right on the parchment pages, often over and even in the middle of the text, as if the writing was describing the contents of the illustrations. So the next question for the experts has to be, is it really all made up? Is it forgery, or willful reverie of the kind that crops up every few years in one psychiatric clinic or other? In their excellent book about the Voynich manuscript, Kennedy and Churchill closely examined the best established forgery theories without finding any conclusive answer. Was the whole thing just some kind of religious delusion? A torrent of inner, or, if you like, heavenly voices scribbled down onto parchment by some delusional fanatic caught in the grips of ecstasy? It's not unknown to happen. Did some mad genius suddenly decide, Now I'll leave the researchers of the future some nut that they'll never be able to crack. Could it really be Roger Bacon, the man with such great knowledge of past ages, who was behind it all? Bacon would have had various reasons for putting down his insights in a secret language, namely, keeping the clergy off his back. On the other hand, Bacon would never have produced anything that was indecipherable. It would have been enough for him that his critics, right up to the Pope himself, would be unable to read the text. He would have wanted his friends to know the key. But that would mean that there would have to be some kind of system hidden in the text somewhere. Today's cryptographers can crack just about any code, especially with the computing power that's available to them nowadays. But only if the text is based on a certain amount of symmetry or has a particular logical structure. This logic is missing entirely from the Voynich text. Or did Bacon copy the Voynich manuscript from a much older source that seemed to him to be important, although he couldn't understand a word? Are the words and pictures perhaps the work of some mystic intent on swindling King Rudolph II out of 600 ducats? That was a fortune back in those days. Or, and this is the latest idea, is Voynich himself the forger? It's no secret that he lived permanently beyond his means and always needed money. One of his contemporaries described Voynich as capable and dynamic, but unbearably coarse and arrogant. Nevertheless, Voynich himself cannot be a candidate, as it has been shown that the manuscript definitely existed before 1887. Old, but how old? After all, what are modern dating methods for? The Voynich manuscript consists of leaves of parchment that have been written on and drawn upon using various inks and colors. Both the paper and the colors are organic, meaning they can be dated using C14 dating techniques. Radiocarbon dating is a process that measures amount of decay of the carbon-14 isotope. The half-life of carbon-14 is known. After 5,600 years, half of the original amount of carbon-14 is gone. After 11,200 years, 3/4, and so on. The method isn't 100% flawless, as it assumes a constant level of atmospheric carbon-14. However, the amount of carbon in the air actually fluctuates quite considerably. On top of that, carbon-14 is not especially reliable for artifacts that are only a few centuries old. And finally, the current owner of the manuscript, Yale University, has steadfastly refused to make the document available for dating. For good reason. In 1965, Yale University acquired the so-called Vinland map, a parchment mappa mundi depicting a large island to the west of Greenland in exactly the location of present-day Newfoundland. If genuine, it would prove that the Vikings had discovered North America. In 1972, however, during a chemical analysis of the ink used on the map, a team of scientists discovered that it contained a chemical substance that wasn't used in inks until the 20th century. This meant the map had to be a fake. Allegedly. Further tests, which were carried out at various intervals until 1995, provided conflicting results with controversial datings. The dispute has to this day not been resolved. For this reason, Yale University has declined to have the Voynich manuscript dated using the C14 method. Even if it were possible to date the manuscript, it still wouldn't mean an end to the controversy, as the question of the provenance of the text remains. To make it clearer, every devout Christian believes that the Bible contains the Word of God, and as far as the Gospels of the New Testament are concerned, the popular belief is that the companions of Jesus of Nazareth wrote down everything that the Master said or did in a sort of running chronicle. These chronicles were even given a name, the Urtexts. In fact, none of that is true. The oft-quoted, and in terms of theological rabulistics, very fertile original texts don't even exist. What have we really got in our hands? Copies that were exclusively produced between the 4th and 10th centuries after Christ's death. And these copies, around 1,500 of them, are in themselves copies of copies, and not one single one of them completely concurs with any of the others. More than 80,000, yes, 80,000 deviations have been counted. There's not one single page of these so-called urtexts that doesn't contain one contradiction or other. Each new edition was the author's interpretation of the original verses rather than a direct copy, and was adapted to meet the needs and attitudes of the times. In the process, these biblical urtexts have amassed thousands of easily verifiable errors. The best known of these texts, Codex Sinaiticus, like the Codex Vaticanus written in the 4th century, was found in 1844 in the monastery of St. Catherine at the foot of Mount Sinai. It contains no less than 16,000 corrections, 16,000, which have been attributed to at least 7 different editors. Some parts of the text have been corrected repeatedly and replaced with another piece of original text. Professor Friedrich Delitzsch, a top expert, found 3,000 copy errors in the text. What has this all got to do with the Voynich manuscript? I'll explain. Let's assume that the text and images are ancient. The content was copied onto parchment in some old hermit's cell without any changes being made to the text, because by this time, no one understood the slightest thing about what the manuscript was actually about. Perhaps it was believed to be a holy text, or other important lore that was only to be read by initiates or in the distant future. The only thing that was important to the assiduous copiers was to preserve the original content for later generations, perhaps because the existing manuscript had been eaten by moths and was beginning to decay. If this was the case, then the manuscript would have no author. Even if the parchment and ink of the Voynich manuscript were only 200 years old, the age of the original content would remain a mystery. It is possible that a successful deciphering attempt will open up a precipice into ancient knowledge that will change the world, inasmuch as the zeitgeist will let it be changed. David Kahn, an American cryptologist, predicts the Voynich manuscript could be described as a bomb that will go off on the day that it is finally decoded. Curiouser and curiouser. As far as the content of the Voynich manuscript is concerned, for the time being there is very little to be said. The script and the illustrations in the text are another thing entirely. They can, to a certain extent, be sorted into rough categories. Folios 2 through 66 feature plants together with their flowers and confusing tangles of roots, always accompanied by text. The following folios, 63 through 73, are filled with astronomical depictions of stars, the sun, the moon, possible zodiacal signs, and naked women lying around in baths or bubbling out of tube-like openings. The 10 pages that follow provide little in the way of optical clues for us today. I can't shake off the amateurish impression that they portray some kind of health spa or fountain of youth, as the women depicted seem to be rising from some kind of colored liquid. The rest is an indecipherable mix of stars of differing sizes and colors, and in between is something that looks like an amulet and radiant flowers. 33 folios are pure text, line after unreadable line. The manuscript itself is made up of different-sized parchments, most of them around 23 by 15 centimeters. Curiously, the pages are numbered in a style typical of that used in the 16th century. Whoever the author or the scribe was, he seems to have been conversant with the ciphers of the time. The curves and strokes, embellishments reminiscent of shorthand, and G and O-like loops do not seem to be comparable to any known alphabet, least of all ancient Greek, Latin, or even Cyrillic. Despite all this, the longer I dwelled on the text, the more I had a feeling that I had seen something similar in a completely different corner of the earth. The story is turning somersaults, and maybe my little contribution will help the cryptographers in some small way toward solving the riddle. Artifacts in Ecuador. In Ecuador, the hot tropical country straddling the equator in South America, there is a small town called Cuenca. There is a church there that carries the name Maria Auxiliadora, which translates roughly as the helpful Mother of God. For 50 years, the Catholic diocese was looked after by a certain Father Carlo Crespi. He enjoyed a reputation as a friend of the Indios, and even during his lifetime, the folk of Cuenca regarded him as a saint. Father Crespi died in 1982, and the people built a monument in his name that is to this day decorated every day with fresh flowers. What was so special about this padre? He listened to the Indios for hours or even days if need be, He won their trust and helped them out in all sorts of difficult situations. The Indios expressed their gratitude.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?